First Peter chapter 4. When we start with First Peter chapter 4, it continues from First Peter chapter 3, right at the end, where it speaks about God giving the authority to Jesus to be at the right hand. So that's where we're talking about the narrative about Jesus right now. And so coming to chapter 4, verse 1, we have a verse that is generally commonly misunderstood. So it says, since therefore Christ suffered for us in the flesh, that becomes an issue because it is commonly seen as Jesus taking the punishment, being whipped and suffered, right, for us in the flesh. But actually, the text doesn't say that at all. So let me just highlight to you some of the challenges that we have in the English translation. The word suffered here comes from a word to mean to be weak, right? In some cases, it actually carries a meaning of to be sick. And it talks about this idea of suffering, which is not really suffering in the sense of, how should I say, in the sense of being tortured or anything else. So let me just point you to a clearer verse, because Jesus has gone through an experience which the English says is suffer, but the Greek actually talks about him being weak. So let me just point you to this. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18. Same English word is the same Hebrew word. So this is the word suffer, right? So it is talking about, for in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. So this should give you a better picture of the word suffer. It is to experience a weakness. Lack of a better word, and experience a weakness, and this weakness is regarding to be tempted. So it talks about an experience that is subjected to the weakness of men, right? And hence, and so we should be able to understand this. Same issue, right? So Christ suffered for us in the flesh is to experience temptation. A moment of weakness, as we ourselves have undergone, all right? So that we can be of the same mind as Jesus, because he has experienced the same. And the idea here is that he has suffered for us to be in the same mind. So the word cease from sin, right? Cease from sin basically means that he did not subject to it. So in the experience that Jesus had at the temptation, for example, in Matthew chapter 3, right? 3 or 4, when we talked about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, where after he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, so he was tempted by the devil. And so this is that idea. The suffering here is not about being tortured, whipped, and bleed. It is about the experience of a temptation that he himself did not sin. And that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men. So that after that experience of the temptation in the wilderness, he was focused on this important aspect, the will of God. So chapter 4, verses 1 and 2 speaks about the temptation, and he did not sin. So very, very important is to make reference to Hebrews. Remember just now we read Hebrews chapter 2 verse 18. And it's about the temptation experience of Jesus. So the word suffer here is a very misleading English word. So people think that Christ suffered for us in the flesh is always about being whipped and tortured. But that's not the point. It's nothing to do with the crucifixion. It has everything to do with the experience of temptation. In the experiencing the weakness of men, being subjected to the temptation to sin, which we read in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 18, that he was tempted in all ways, but he did not sin. And then after that temptation experience in the wilderness tells us that Jesus spent the rest of his time in the flesh, not for the lust of men, but to do the will of God. Now that in itself tells us a lot about his ministry, tells us that Jesus is very focused on what he came to do. Just like in John chapter 4, right? The woman at the well, where they were hungry, the disciples went to buy food, and then the story of the woman at the well came and gone, and the disciples asked whether Jesus had something to eat, and then Jesus says, "My food is to do the will of God who sent me." And so this entire passage here very much explains to us how he faced his temptation experience and focused on doing the will of God. And in the same way, to arm ourselves with the same mind, that we too should have the same focus. We should not be preoccupied with temptations and lusts of men, or cravings of men of this world, but to focus on doing the will of God. I think the example that Jesus leaves us is to really lead us on a direction which the Old Testament has been quite clear, to be focused, to do what God says. And so Jesus gives us that life example. And that's 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. Now in verse 3, he says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles." Now again, this is the nations. Remember, the audience are believing Jews who are in the diaspora, that is dispersed across Asia Minor in the present-day Turkey. And this author is saying, we have actually spent a lot of time behaving like the nation. So the Jews have tried to assimilate into the lifestyle of the nations of the world. And so he says, we walk in a number of descriptions here, he says, right? This is in verse 3, that we have walked. Now remember, walk is a Hebrew concept of conducting our lives or how we live. And we have these few words here. Lewdness is unbridled lusts, right? Lust itself is craving, and this is fleshly craving. Drunkenness is drinking too much wine. So drinking wine is not the problem. So too much of the wine is the problem. Revelries would be, well, I guess you call it partying. in the modern day, where the old days of partying is totally godless, right? Godless. Drinkings. Drinkings would be a lot of banqueting. So the eating and drinking of the old days, right? And then abominable, or what we call prohibited idolatries, worship of other gods. So the author is actually basically trying to say that Jesus was tempted. These people who are the audience are also tempted, and they have to move away from all these temptations and focus on doing the will of God and not practicing the lifestyle of the nations that they are dispersed in. That much is the saying, right? And in verse 4, with regards to all these bad habits or bad way of life, about walking is a way of life, do not run with them in the same flood. Meaning, don't behave like them. Right? Don't behave like them. And they will speak evil of you. Because when you're not like them, then you're very strange people. I guess in today's world, it would be like peer pressure. If you don't behave like the mass crowd, then you are an odd one out. They will have to give an account to him. And who is him? And this will be God, who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So this is always about the Jewish idea that judgment is always there. So be careful with what you do. So for this reason, it is important then, and this is a very strange verse, so let me just highlight it. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, who might be judged according to the men in the flesh, but live according to God in the spirit. Now, as I had mentioned to you in the last chapter, I am not able to explain to you why the gospel is preached to the dead. And we have to leave it to another day. This sounds like a very strange thing, and I have not come to a point of full appreciation of what this means, right? But for us today, for the purpose of this study, it would be important for us to realize that we also have to give an account to God. And so be careful with how we live our lives. And so that's the whole crux of chapter 4, verses 1 to 6. Now, this second section here is now on some more practical terms. So if you take a look at verse 7, verse 7 is speaking about the end of all things. End of all things basically means the end times, right? Is at hand. It's coming. But one of the things you notice that throughout the Old Testament, end time seems to be always around the corner but never end. But the idea here is to live as if it is coming to an end. And so it reminds us to be serious, be sober, and then be watchful, and this is to be attentive. And this type of behavior is completely the opposite of the ones that was described above, of partying, drunkenness, and that kind of a living. Because people doing that has no concern about God's judgment. And so in verse 7 comes to a point that, everything we do is to do the will of God. What is the will of God? It's in the Bible. It's to glorify Him, to do things that God is pleased, to do things that honor God, and to do things that glorify God. All right? And so here, to be serious or to be sober, and to be watchful or attentive and watchful of what is happening around us is important. Verse 8, above all things, have fervent love one for another. Now, right up to here has no problems. The problem begins with this particular phrase. Love will cover a multitude of sins. Now, this comes from Proverbs. Let's see. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12. Now, Proverbs has a lot of very good proverbial advice, and this author pulled this out, that love will cover a multitude of sins. And this is the second part of the verse. So it left off the first part. It says, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins. But let me just briefly explain to you. In the Greek, this love is phileo. And it is, how should I say? The Greek Old Testament is phileo. The New Testament Greek is agape. So there seems to be a confusion of how the words are used. The Hebrew is ahav, which is the standard word. The word sins here does not mean the regular sins. It means rebellion, which is pesha. And this is rebellion. To say that love has an ability to accommodate rebellion and fights, so that love itself can, what we call, put out the fire of strife, basically. Because the verse in Proverbs 10 verse 12 speaks that hatred incurs strife. And strife is to fight with each other. So when you put hatred into the picture, striving or rebellion and fighting exists. But when love is put into the picture, then striving will cease. Because love is said to be greater than how people exudes hatred. That would be how this would work in this particular verse. That above all, have fervent love one for another. So as people of God love each other, then fighting between the people will cease. So this word will cover is an idiom, that it will put out the fire of rebellion. Okay. Verse 9. Continuing on about this love for one another, be hospitable, don't grumble, right? And the idea here is they need to not just love each other, but to serve each other. So let me just briefly explain this, that each one has received a gift or a grace or a favor or something that God has given us. That's all it means. We have received something from God, so we need to use it for one another. Why? Because when God bestows things for us, give us good gifts. To some, there will be financial. To others, will be some other material things. To use it as good stewards of the favor of God. Which means that we have actually found favor in God's eyes, and God has given us things. And these things have to do with how we can minister to one another. As good stewards, use it well. And this must continue from this verse, right? Love for one another, be hospitable to one another, and serve each other with whatever God has endowed or given us as His gifts or His presence or His abilities. And the author says, if you are able to speak which means to preach, to talk about things of God. So you must speak as the oracles of God. Speak as if this is God's word. In verse 11, the idea of oracles means the utterance of God, as if God is speaking. So one who are able to preach and teach must do so with the authority of God. If anyone is to serve, let him serve with the ability which God has given to us. That the focus actually is not in the doing. The focus is that in all things God may be glorified. And I will break the sentence here. That God may be glorified, to whom belong the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And so, whom will be God? This is actually a subordinate clause. So it reads that in all things God may be glorified, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever, through Jesus Christ. And it can be inserted right here, because it's a stand-alone clause that Jesus Christ is the one who is pointing us to the Father, and that as Jesus has gone through the temptations, has focused on doing the will of God, we too should be doing the same as is described here, that everything we do, and if it glorifies God, guess what? That is the will of God. So whenever we talk about the will of God, we usually think about, what is the specific thing that is the will of God? Actually, anything that we do that pleases God is the will of God. Anything that we do that glorifies God is the will of God. I think we should be reminded of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus said, "Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Same concept. So everything that the author is trying to put together is trying to use the experiences of Jesus, link it to these people who are dispersed, the dispersed believing Jews, and encourage them that don't be caught up with the lifestyle of the people around them as they are dispersed into the nations, but be able to do the will of God like how Jesus have done the will of God. And in this, God will be glorified. Now, that is how verse 7 to verse 11 comes through. Now, in the next portion, it speaks about suffering. Now, again, let me just point out to you. In verse 1, I have mentioned to you that the word suffering, the English word for suffering there, and in this case, the suffering here is different. I cannot defend how the translators have done it, but verse 1 talks about the experience of temptations. In this particular section here, it is about persecution. Okay? And so the author uses the word fiery trial, that their faith will be tested, which is to try you. The word trial, and lead us not into temptation. That is the same, right? Temptation. A fiery trial would be a difficult time. So a fiery trial could also be seen as the wanderings in the wilderness, as Job himself has gone through his temptations. And so he says, don't be surprised, right? That if all these things happen to you, it's nothing strange. If you are associated with God in Christ and Christ has suffered duly, then you will also. So if you remember, this will bring us back to the thinking of John chapter 15, John chapter 16, right? And John chapter 17. The idea here is you're in the world, but you're not of the world. And if the master is, so will the followers. So this is very much what it's trying to say. And if you suffer persecution, and so there is a few words here, then you may be glad with exceeding joy because you are suffering for the right reasons. If you're suffering for your faith, you are suffering for the right reasons. So if you are reproached for the name of Christ, you are blessed, should be happy. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. And the fact that people dislike us because of our commitment to do the will of God, so be it. That's basically what the author is saying. On their part, if they revile you, well, they are blaspheming against God. Right? They're saying things that is bad against God. But for you, He is glorified. That is what we're doing, right? When you do the will of God, God is glorified, and that's all it is. Now, if this is done in the midst of trials, in the midst of persecution, well, so be it. There is no such thing called do the will of God and everything will be fine. So things will be fine and doing the will of God are actually two separate, independent things. What may happen to us or what may be thrown against us, and in this passage says we have fiery trial, is independent, because if you had the faith to do the will of God and to glorify God, then we may be subjected to the world's persecution. And so the author says, you know what, that's fine. Be happy with that. Because suffering for the will of God, for the faith in God, is okay. Reproach for the name of Christ, when people call you Christians and you suffer as a Christian, it's also okay. Because Christ points us to God and differentiates us from the rest of them in the world. So it says, let none of you suffer. And this suffer is not about temptation. This suffer is literally suffering. Verse 15 uses a different word. This word is to experience, right? None of you experience temptation. Sorry, this is the same as verse 1. So this word suffer is the same as verse 1. It is to experience temptation. When you are tempted, do not get into the situation that you are classified as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or, busybody. I guess people don't like busybodies poking their nose, and everybody will revile against them. And so in verse 16, he says, if anyone is dishonored, right? If anyone is made ashamed. This word suffer is not this word suffer. So one of the challenges we have in the English Bible is difficult, right? We need to have a little bit of insight as what is underlying the words. And so in verse 16 it says, if anyone is made ashamed, let him not be ashamed. And that is how the verse goes, right? Let him glorify God in this matter. And so if somebody is to make us shameful, well, it's okay to be ashamed, to make shame or put shame on us if we are a Christian. And it is because we are a Christian. But not as a murderer, as a thief, as an evildoer, or as a busybody. That is how this particular passage is saying. And so, if we are tempted, don't become one of them. If we are made ashamed, let it be because we are a Christian. And whatever we do, it is because we are doing the will of God. We are trying to please God, and let that be. That would be fine. And that would mean that we are suffering because of our faith that we have in Christ Jesus and in God. Now, let me just wrap this up in the last section. It says, for the time has come for judgment. Now, judgment means when God decides that he is going to punish. Judgment is always in the mind of all Jewish believers. Unfortunately, judgment is seldom in the mind of Gentile believers. Why? Because the Jews, when they grow up, has this understanding of God in mind, that God will always judge man one day. And so we always read, like in Matthew chapter 7, in that day, when not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter into the kingdom of heaven. And so that whole concept of judgment is very clear in the mind of Jewish believers. But in the mind of Gentile believers, where we did not grow up with this kind of idea, people don't think of judgment. And so we read of the kind of lifestyle that the Gentiles have, that the author don't be like them. Don't live amongst them. Do what they do. Do the will of God. And then he says, for the judgment will begin at the house of God. This appears to be a bit of a challenge. What is a house of God? Literally speaking, the house of God will be the temple. And by extension, Jerusalem. And the idea that is being proposed here by the author is saying this: when the time comes for judgment, God will always judge his own first. And so maybe when you read Matthew 25, it might give us a picture of that. And so the author says, if it begins with us, then what else to those who do not obey the gospel of God? The good news that God has given is to believe in him, that he has sent his only begotten Son. And for those who reject God, who goes away from God, becomes an issue here. So in verse 17, he says, this is actually a quotation. If the righteous one is now scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? This is in, again, Proverbs 11:31. This chapter, we have 2 verses from Proverbs. Now we have a slight problem with this verse. So let me try to explain to you. Scarcely saved. Sinner appear. These words are what we say is in the Greek Old Testament. But it does not appear in the Hebrew. The Hebrew would say that if you go back and read your Proverbs 11:31, it doesn't say this. It says, if the righteous will be recompense. Oops. On the earth. Then these other words will read this way. Okay. So let me just briefly explain what I've just written here. These words appear in the Greek Old Testament, but it does not appear in the Hebrew Old Testament, which is why when you go and read Proverbs 11:31, you will never find the verse saying this. What you will find in Proverbs 11:31 is if the righteous one will be recompensed on the earth, how much more the ungodly and the sinner. And so if you look at Proverbs 11:31 from the Hebrew, it tends to fit into the discussion of judgment. That if the righteous one is being judged here on earth, how much more will the ungodly, those without God, and the sinner, those who offend God, will face the anger and judgment of God. And so that is how Proverbs 11:31 in the Hebrew will say. But in the Greek, it says, if the righteous one is barely saved, meaning just cross into the narrow gate. Now, how will the ungodly and sinner fit into this whole picture? So it has a slightly different meaning. So I think you need to go back and check this out. Proverbs 11:31 in the Hebrew reads very differently from the Greek. So now if you take a look at verse 19, we can then ask ourselves, does verse 19 speak about verse 18? So therefore, let those who suffer, and verse 19, the word suffer is about experience temptation, according to the will of God, commit their souls to Him in doing good, as to a faithful Creator. Now, this is important because every one of us must present ourselves to God. He created us, we are to present ourselves back to Him. And so the will of God is absolute. And so this whole chapter speaks about when you experience temptation, do not behave like the people of the world, but we should then conduct ourselves according to how it would please God. So will of God is it sounds very big to many people, it sounds very mysterious, but in simple terms is do what pleases God. So when we say, can you do the will of the parent? How would a child do the will of the parent? Now, we always say the parent makes certain decisions, and that's why the child must be a doctor, because the parent wants the child to be a doctor. But that's not what will of God means. Will of God means this: the parents would like the child to make them happy. And God knows what is right. God knows what is best, and in principle, whatever we do that pleases God and will glorify Him will be the will of God. And so a child, to please the will of the parent, is to find out what would make the parent happy. So if we were to do things according to the will of God, we have to find out what would make God happy. And here it says, doing good makes God happy. So let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven, becomes that rallying point for 1 Peter chapter 4. Okay?